9 students would travel up into the Ural Mountains. None of them would ever be seen alive again. Before we start, as a warning, this is a true story. Some pretty weird and unexplainable events take place, and it's pretty disturbing, so viewer discretion is advised. The story starts off in Russia, January 1959. From what is currently known now as Ural State Technical University, 10 experienced members of the school's tourism club made plans to travel up Mount Otorten in the Ural Mountains. The Ural Mountains serve as a geographical border between Europe and Asia. The snowy slopes leading up to the peaks are very hard to climb, and the journey isn't something that just anybody should consider. At the time of their expedition, because of the path that they would be taking, and more importantly the season they'd be enduring, it was classified as a Category 3 route, which meant it was recognized as the most difficult in its class. They were all experienced and well prepared, but even so, it was a big enough task that an estimated 3 weeks of travel awaited them. From January 25th to the 27th, they would all take several modes of transport, ranging from trains, buses, trucks, and sleds, until they eventually arrived at an abandoned mining settlement where they would begin their trek. The group was led by a 23-year-old man named Igor Dyatlov, known well for his vast knowledge of cross-country skiing and mountain climbing. Due to joint pain and other health concerns, one of the students named Yuri Yudin would cut their trip short and make their way back with the sled on the 28th. From the 29th to the 31st, the experienced, now 9-member group would make their way to Ospia River, where they would spend a few nights preparing for the climb. Intending to make their bags lighter, they left behind some food and equipment at the site for use on the trip back. The next day, February 1st, they would all make their hike to what would now come to be known as Dyatlov Pass. Their plan seemed to be to get over the pass and make camp, prepare themselves for the next night, and continue onwards toward Otorten. But because of ever-worsening snowstorms and lack of visibility, they began to lose their way. They began unknowingly aiming towards a different peak named Kholat-Syakhl. Upon realizing where they had gone wrong, they set up camp on the slope of the mountain. Even though just 1.5 kilometers below there was a forested area that would have provided relief from the relentless weather. The student that had turned back, Yuri Yudin, would later speculate that Dyatlov probably didn't want to lose the altitude they had gained, or he decided to practice camping on the mountain slope. February 2nd. Every last member of the Dyatlov group would die. It was -30 Celsius outside, and for unknown reasons, all 9 of them would decide to leave the tent without adequate clothing or footwear. Some walked through the snow in socks, some walked out barefoot. Everything that they would have ever needed to survive was left in the tent behind them. The group would make their way down the mountain, where they would reach the end of the forest near a large cedar. This is where Doroshenko and Krivonishenko would stay behind and start a fire. The 7 others would keep descending the mountain where they would reach Lozva River, digging out a den to escape the elements. When the group returned back to the cedar for the other 2, they would find both of them dead, presumably from hypothermia. But oddly, they were covered in unexplained bruises and injuries. They cut the clothes off their comrades for survival and continued back up the mountain. Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova made attempts to get back to the tent but died of hypothermia on the way up. Nearby, Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, Tibur, and Dubinina would sadly meet their fates as well. Before they had all left, Dyatlov had said that he would notify their sports club back at the bottom when they were returning. When the expected date for Dyatlov's telegram had passed and there was no communication, nobody batted an eye. It was already past February 12th, which was roughly the expected date for the telegram, but a journey of this size, a few days extension of something like this would be completely normal. Near the end of February, the group still hadn't reached out, but officials weren't too keen on starting a search and rescue operation. They had even lied that they had made contact with the team and that they were just delayed by the weather conditions. February 20th, the group's relatives urged for a search team. 6 days later, the first rescue groups were sent out, ranging from students and teachers to police and Mansi guides. The Mansi are an indigenous people that live in the area. They found the camp. The tent was completely destroyed and torn, covered in snow, and it looked as if it was cut apart from the inside by a knife. A ski pole near the area looked like it was damaged by the knife as well. The next day, on the 27th, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were found by the remnants of the fire they had made. They were only wearing underwear when they were found. They didn't have any shoes on either. The cedar they were found by, the branches were broken up to 5 meters high. Whether they were climbing to see something or to get away from something is unknown. The same day they found Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova. Dyatlov was found on his back nearby while the others were found roughly 200 feet away. They seemed to be desperately trying to make their way back to the tent, but sadly all failed. All 5 froze to death, except Slobodin had injuries the others didn't have. They had a fractured skull, and nobody knows why. After quite some time had passed, on May 4th, the rest would be found. In a 75-meter ravine, 4 meters under the snow, and 250 feet away from everyone else. Out of Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, Tibwo, and Dubinina, 3 of them seemingly didn't die of hypothermia. Their injuries were extreme. Their ribs were broken. Some of the eyes were removed. Tibwo's skull was completely crushed, and Dubinina's tongue was gone. No evidence could account for the events that took place that day, and there was nothing to suggest that anything or anyone else could have been up there except for the students. The doctor in charge of examining the bodies stated that to the best of his knowledge, no man could inflict this level of injury no matter how hard they tried. The force that had been applied to the group was equal to a 60-mile-per-hour car crash to their insides, yet no outside soft tissue had been damaged. There weren't any external wounds to match the bone fractures either, almost as if they were subjected to an immense amount of pressure. Radiation was found on many of the bodies, enough so that it was as if they had been handling radioactive materials for a prolonged period of time. During the funerals, the first 5 were found with deep brown tans. Other family members recalled an orange coloration to their skin, and gray hair as if they had aged substantially. The chief investigator took a Geiger counter with him as he approached the site, and the device started sounding off rapidly. The person responsible for the radioactivity report stated that this level of radiation couldn't possibly be due to natural exposure. Analysis for radiation came back on May 27th for the bodies that were tested. The case was promptly and mysteriously closed the very next day. The chief investigator later revealed that he had actually been ordered by senior officials in the government to close the case and classify everything because of eyewitnesses. The eyewitnesses they were referring to had to do with bright flying spheres that many people had seen in the area, directly around where the students were found. Some say that an avalanche caused all of this. They could have heard the audible cracking of the ice and snow while they were in their tents sleeping, warning them of an incoming avalanche, promptly waking up in panic with no time to put on proper clothing. This would also explain why the 4 that were so far from the rest of the group were buried under that much snow, and how they had also sustained such horrible injuries. But there was no real evidence of an avalanche in the area, nor had there been any reported incidents of avalanches in the last 100 expeditions. Footprint patterns leading away from the tents also showed no sign of anybody in a panic. It looked as if they were walking at a normal and calm pace, like nothing was wrong. Another hypothesis is that infrasound could have played a part in all of this. Wind moving in and around the peaks could have possibly created frequencies below the lower limit of human hearing. Infrasound is capable of causing physical and mental distress, leading to panic attacks. In that state, they would likely have been trying to escape the horrifying feeling as quickly as possible. By the time they had gotten down the hill, they could have regained their composure, but in the pitch-black darkness it would have been way too difficult to get back to the tent. One other theory suggests that the campsite could have been between the path of a Soviet parachute mine exercise. There are records of parachute mine testing, not only within the area, but also within the same time frame that the students would have been there. Parachute mines detonate in the air, and the injuries that you would sustain would be similar to the ones the students were exposed to. Heavy internal damage, with barely any on the outside. This theory would also match up with the eyewitness accounts of glowing orbs in the sky at the time. Some believe that radiological weapons had something to do with it, but the dispersal of such a weapon would have affected all of them, but only some were affected. Along the topic of radiation, the skin and hair discoloration could also be explained by a natural form of mummification. This is what they could have looked like after 3 months of exposure to the cold and wind. Most of them had died from hypothermia. Hypothermia can also cause a behavior known as paradoxical undressing, where victims will start unlayering in response to a wrongly perceived feeling of burning warmth. Some of them, however, were found with extra layers on that came from other members, contradicting the idea of paradoxical undressing. The only survivor, Yuri Yudin, who had luckily turned back early on in the trip, said, "If I had a chance to ask God just one question, it would be what really happened to my friends that night." Many theories try to explain the unanswered questions of Dyatlov Pass, but every plausible theory seems to somehow always contradict something else. After everything, after all of these unexplained events, the official cause of death for the Dyatlov team was stated to be a compelling, unknown force.